The way that we judge our bodies today didn't start on Instagram and is by no means a modern invention. It started over 2,000 years ago, carved in marble. Gym culture, fashion, art, and insecurity all quietly trace back to the ancient forms which we created. Today, I would like to unpack how classical sculpture has affected the way that we see ourselves and the damage that it carries with it today. So please get comfortable as I take you through the forms and the meanings of classical sculpture. Part 1. Greek archaic sculpture. Starting off here all the way back in the archaic, so around 750 to 480 we're going to go with. This is really a time of self-discovery for the Greeks. It follows a period of so-called dark ages, even though they weren't really dark. And Greece at this stage is really a patchwork of these city-states, or polis as we call them today. And there's widespread colonization across the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. There's trade networks emerging all across this kind of wide area. And there's civic institutions and politics beginning to develop. But it's important to know that many of these city-states were just run by tyrants at this early stage. And this context matters because sculpture is being produced by societies that are still figuring themselves out. And when I say sculpture was produced, I mean it was produced. Sculpture completely exploded in this period. This was largely due to the increased wealth from trade and colonization, but also cultural centers like Delphi began to spring up, where sculpture is used to serve a practical purpose here as votive offerings, dedications, and just displays of wealth and status. It's not quite art for art's sake yet. Sculpture is very much functional and symbolic. Now, I mentioned earlier that the Greeks were interacting with many other different societies, but their interactions with Egypt are especially important for art. Egyptian statues from this period provide a clear visual framework for the Greeks. They're frontally facing, they're very static, quite rigid, their arms are at their sides, and they have very flat torso. One leg is usually slightly in front of the other. However, Egyptian statues are usually fully clothed, and they're formalized and almost godlike, but not quite idealized. They're meant to be timeless, eternal, and otherworldly. Now, Greeks adopt this form, but they really reinterpret the meaning. So the first main type of sculpture from Greece at this period that we're going to look at is the koroi statues, which are male sculptures of idealized youths. They stand rigid, front-facing, with weight evenly distributed on either leg. Now, the physical anatomy is very much simplified, with very flat torsos, patterned hair, and quite stylized muscles and faces. But the nudity you see here is intentional. The Egyptian statues were not nude. This is a Greek thing here. Now, the Kouros is a portrait in some sense, but really it presents us with an ideal rather than an individual. Now, their counterparts are the Korai statues. They're always fully clothed rather than the males, and usually in a peplos earlier on and a bit later into a chiton. I have to say the clothing here is just beautifully carved with the folds and the patterns and the textures. It just looks so lovely. Now, the emphasis here is not on anatomy, but more on virtue, modesty, and that social role. There's a clear contrast which is developed here. The male body, virtue is expressed through physical idealness, but for the females, their virtue is expressed more through modesty and adornments. Now, this gender divide here is really foundational and it echoes forward throughout classical sculpture. Now, as I said before, there isn't too much variation in these sculptures. It is important to note there is a slow development throughout the archaic towards more realistic statues. Early archaic figures are extremely rigid and static, but as time moves on, figures become slightly more realistic looking, the proportions look a bit more natural, and the muscles look more defined and realistic. Still very much stiff by later standards, but progress nonetheless. Sculptors are still learning how bodies actually work and how to go from flesh to stone. And one of my favorite conventions of classical sculpture is the famous archaic smile. And this is a slight upward curve of the lips that appears across many statues. However, this is not an emotional smile in that sense that we think of it today. It's not to present happiness or the person's content in any way. It's more of actually just a technical solution to demonstrate that the person is alive. As sculptors later develop the anatomy and master realism, the smile is later dropped. The archaic period is so important in classical sculpture. It is the foundations of everything. It already establishes the human body as basically the main artistic subject and demonstrates how these human bodies can carry values and meaning. And already as well, you can start to see the idealization chosen over realism. Everything later, from the classic and Hellenistic and Roman, builds on this archaic foundation. Part 2, the classical period. Welcome to the classical Greek world. So this is 480 to 323 BCE. Now this period begins just after the Persian Wars in 480 BCE, where we see most of the Greek city-states actually band together to defeat the invading Persians. Now after this, Greece, especially Athens, really starts to develop a kind of superiority complex. Of course, there's also the growth of democracy in Athens. Now with the newfound wealth, there is newfound state investment in art and public display, and this is when sculpture really becomes civic and almost institutionalized as well as ideological. We're really working with a society that believes it's one history here, and it shows in their art, definitely. So in sculpture, there's a major shift from the archaic to classical. Now the major changes here is that sculpture is a lot less rigid. There's more believable proportions and a much more natural anatomy, as well as the calm, stoic faces of the sculptures. Figures really appear alive, but very much rational and in control. So you're looking at some classical sculptures here, and yes, they do look real, but are they ideal or are they real? They're definitely ideal. I mean, did they actually look like that? No, they don't. There's no imperfections at all. There's no age, there's no wrinkles, there's no signs of wear and tear at all. They're completely perfect. This is the best possible human, not just any old average one. Okay, so another major convention here, the contrapposto pose. This is really one of the most important developments in Western art. Weight is shifted onto one leg, which results in a slightly tilted body, tilted hips, tilted shoulders to one side, and the weight's on one leg. This creates kind of an element of movement. It's kind of like a natural imbalance and almost suggests that they're ready to strike. The body looks like it almost could move at any moment. This is finally a break in the stiffness of archaic, although there's not much movement. It's something. Let me introduce you to Polykleitos. Now Polykleitos was both a sculptor and a theorist. He wrote a very famous treatise called the Canon, which is now lost, but he did write it, we think. Now his main idea is that beauty comes from mathematical proportions, where each aspect of the anatomy should relate to the other. And this should create balanced symmetry throughout. So for example, the head should be 1/7 of the entire body. This is where beauty really becomes quantifiable. Okay, so we're now going to look at a textbook example from the classical period of that contrapposto pose, as well as the Polykleitos' canon. This is Polykleitos' Doryphoros, or spear bearer sculpture. Now this is a physical demonstration of the canon. The original was in bronze. This is a Roman marble copy, and obviously it has ideal proportions and that calm, in control, rational face. Now this really represents the ideal male citizen. It's calm, it's composed, it's disciplined, it's everything the Greeks aspired to be. But it's not a man, it's a philosophical argument. Sculpture really becomes a visual expression of the Greeks' ethics. Now looking closer at the face, again as I said, it's really calm and restrained. And this again reflects the Greeks' values. Excess is dangerous, and restraint and control and stoicism should be celebrated. And that basically finishes up classical sculpture. I mean, I could go on and on about it all day. This is really where the foundations of Western thoughts are made in terms of beauty. This establishes the perfect male form and shows that proportion equals beauty. And the effects of this period would be felt a long way down the line. Part 3, the Hellenistic. So we're going here from Alexander the Great's death in 323 BCE to 31 BCE. Now Alexander obviously spread Greek culture far and wide, and after he dies, that empire is kind of split up into a few different kingdoms that I'm not going to get into. The main thing here is Greek culture has been spread and it's now much wider than it was before. Power is no longer concentrated in single polis, it's now much more spread out. and kings rule over wide, diverse populations. Now, this is really much a world that feels unstable, and the art reflects that. While classical art was all about calmness, balance, restraint, the Hellenistic explodes onto the scene in intense emotion and movement. I love the Hellenistic. The key changes here are faces now show emotion for the first time, proper emotion, joy, fear, anger, pain, just the whole spectrum is explored finally. Bodies also move finally properly. They twist, they collapse, they strain, they bend. It's great. And figures really interact with the space around them for the first time. The body is no longer controlled, the body is experienced. For the first time, it's not about ideals or virtues or the perfect human, it's just about the human. So sculptors really now care about the emotion of the people they're depicting here. They care about the sorrow, the grief, the fear of the figures. Now this is beautifully represented in the facial expressions of the sculptures themselves, with furrowed brows and wide open mouths and real tension in the cheeks and the eyes. Viewers are really meant to feel something. It's sculpture which finally demands empathy. And no longer are we balancing on one leg and calling it movement. Finally here, we've got proper action going on. Bodies twist and turn on multiple different axes, and limbs really extend outwards towards the viewer. It's like the figures have finally been caught mid-action. And now finally, there is a clear expansion of the subject matter. No longer have we just got one idealized youth male that we're presenting again and again. It's now drunk people, it's elderly people, it's children, it's foreigners, it's the poor and the weak. There's a real explore of the human experience in all its different forms here. Imperfection is finally worthy of art. Sculpture is becoming democratic. There's sagging flesh, tired muscles, awkward poses. Bodies are no longer just symbols of order, they're sites of experience. And I have to say, mythological figures are given this beautiful kind of human aspect. Gods and mythic beings are showing drunk, tired, and vulnerable. They're no longer distant or untouchable. Divinity has finally been humanized. And one of my absolute favorite sculptures from the whole of Greece is the famous Barberini faun. Now, a faun is the Roman name for the Greek satyr, which is a Dionysian, woodland, half animal, half human spirit. And in the sculpture, the satyr is drunk perhaps, tired, he's exposed. His body is completely open, he's defenseless. It's not heroic, it's not controlled. It is erotic, but it's very vulnerable. I feel like this sculpture really embodies that loss of classical dignity, and I'm so for it. Even myth is no longer safe from realism. Now, Hellenistic sculpture is really best seen from all the different angles, and it rewards the viewer from this. Now, I could sit here all day talking about Hellenistic, but I'm not going to. I love the period. It's all so emotional and intense, and I love it. And obviously, it opens up the subject matter, introduces real realism, and really has that psychological depth that was lacking before. This period really asks humanity itself why it just can't be art. Why do we need to aspire to be something godlike, to be worthy of beauty? For me, this is where art really becomes art. I think art is all about provoking emotion in the viewer, surely. And I think this is where it only really starts. Part 4, Roman sculpture. Okay, so into the Roman Empire. 1st century BCE, we're going from here with the Republic, obviously, all the way up until the 3rd or 4th or even 5th centuries CE. Now, Rome expands, obviously, from Rome itself all the way across Italy and eventually across the entire Mediterranean. Now, a huge, diverse population is spread out across the Mediterranean, Europe, North Africa, and in the East. But most citizens will never see the emperor they supposedly serve. So art becomes a key tool for communication. Sculpture goes from cultural to administrative. Now, we cannot talk about Roman sculpture and Roman art without talking about Greek art, because really the Romans inherit so much from Greece, but the art in their sculpture is really from admiration. They admire the Greeks. They have sculptures in their own fancy villas, and a lot of their sculptures themselves are replications of the Greek ones. So many of the most famous Greek sculptures that I've shown you only survive because they are Roman copies in marble. But Romans don't just copy it blindly, they do it deliberately. They want to be the heir to the Greek culture. And they also adapt the Greek originals. There's more political messaging, but also more naturalism and different facial expressions. Okay, so sculpture in the Roman world, I'm going to be honest, for me is really all about portraiture. Roman portraiture focuses on recognizable faces, individual identity, and status, and this can be seen on busts and coins. Firstly, we're going to look at Republican verism, so Republican portraiture. Before emperors, Republican elites, politicians, they valued age, wisdom, and experience. Faces show wrinkles, sagging skin, and, a lived experience in those faces. This verism is really putting across the message of I've lived, I've experienced, I've dealt with these things before, you can trust me. Now this is still kind of like the Hellenistic here. It's very like anti-classical, it's very real and not idealized at all. But then imperialism changes everything, and particularly one man, Augustus. Now the first Roman Empire needs legitimacy after a civil war, and he really wants to separate himself from everything that's came before him. Because, Rome, it went through so much during the Civil War kind of time, and he's wanting to bring in a new period of life and demonstrate that this is a new era beginning. He chooses to look eternally youthful and almost godlike, really. He's clean shaven, he has an idealized body, and he's really reminiscent of that classical Greek style. He really shows what he wants Rome to believe he is, rather than who he actually is. His youth represents the renewal, his beauty, the divine favour, while the calm expressions, stability. So Augustus's image is standardized and sent across the empire for all his subjects to see, with the messages he wants to be portrayed. And this is, as you're probably thinking, propaganda. The same face and the same messages everywhere you look. Now, it's not just the faces that turn political, also the bodies themselves, because there's lots of statues this time as well. There's not just busts. There's big statues of Augustus and many of the other emperors, right? Armor would represent military superiority, a toga could mean civic order, and being completely naked would just make them godlike. So the body can also be used as a political tool. Now, I'm not going to go through all the emperors and talk about their portraits. It's something that I could do in another video if you're interested. But I'm going to skip to Hadrian. Now, by Hadrian, the beard is back in fashion, wrinkles are back in fashion, and experience shown in the face is back in fashion. Hadrian's message is clear. He wants to align more with that Greek philosopher look and show his wisdom. He's also very much removing himself from the previous disastrous, to say the least, emperors. And now this sets a trend, and many emperors begin to follow suit. So citizens really are constantly surrounded by this imperial imagery. As I said, this is when it turns into propaganda. They're in public spaces, forums, temples, just everywhere you look. Now this is how sculpture really enforces hierarchy and control and becomes a tool for the empire itself. Now there are some late Roman trends we should mention. As the empire begins to decline, bodies become a lot stiffer and faces more abstract. There's less interest in realism and more in symbolism, and this eventually sets the stage for Christian art. So Roman sculpture is obviously hugely significant. It's where art really becomes political. It actually establishes the political imagery that we still see today, and shows how aesthetics can be manipulated for power. So that, thankfully, rounds off Rome. So the fifth and final part of this video is going to be the analysis. I really want to leave behind the historical narrative and get into what this all means for us today. Now, what we can clearly see here from our study of the ancient sculpture record is that the body is really an expression of virtue. For Greeks, a beautiful body meant a good citizen. It was philosophical, rational, disciplined, controlled. You weren't actually admiring muscles or abs, you were admiring character. But why the body specifically? Well, the human body is really the most universal symbol. Everyone has one, and it crosses status, wealth, whatever. Sculpture communicates things instantly. And in societies without mass media, sculpture is the message. So for the Greeks, a disordered, fat, whatever, saggy, old body meant weakness. So for the Greeks, an undesirable body represented a lack of self-control and moral weakness. Now the Romans take this idea and really shift it. Sculpture becomes strategic, repetitive, state-controlled, just so political. The emperors use their bodies and their faces to legitimize rule and spread their political messaging. Truth becomes secondary to belief. Ancient sculpture really functioned like text because not many people could read in the ancient world. So it was sculpture that spread the messages of values and ideals and power and hierarchy. But there is a huge problem with inheritance. Classical sculpture doesn't disappear. It reappears again and again, reinventing itself right up until today. The ideas remain, but the why is forgotten. And we inherit the form, but not the philosophy. Firstly, in the Renaissance, we have artists like Michelangelo and Donatello really becoming obsessed with that classical style of art. They see Greek sculpture as perfection, truth, and the true pinnacle of art. The ideal male body returns as the artistic standard, but it lacks that philosophical depth that it had before. Now, jumping all the way forward to around about today, or the 19th, 20th century, museums begin to fill up with this classical art. Now, ancient sculptures were originally painted in outdoor sanctuaries and contextualized. But modern museums strip that context from statues, are obviously not painted whatsoever, and are lit dramatically. This is the illusion where marble becomes the ideal and feeds into modern ideas of purity and perfection. But this isn't antiquity, it's just a curated fantasy. And one look at modern fitness culture today, and you can see the damage that classical sculpture still carries. It treats bodies as a commodity, a project, and a status symbol. The idealism that we've seen before is suddenly considered normal, achievable, almost expected. But ancient ideals were symbolic, they weren't targets. None of the ancient Greek philosophers that you see completely ripped and muscular actually looked like that. Now I also really want to touch on the looks maxing movement. It really treats the body as optimizable and measurable and just so numerical and quantitative. Value becomes tied to body fat percentage, facial ratios, and bone structure. Ancient sculptors carved ideas, and yet modern people are trying to carve themselves. This is where it becomes extremely dangerous. Now extreme leanness is framed as discipline. There are echoes of ancient virtues, but completely distorted and misguided. Bodies are meant to be static ideals. They fluctuate, they change, and they grow. But this is by no means me sitting here and saying, oh, look at the hard beauty standards that men today have to put up with. These standards were created by men in the ancient world and were brought back by men again and again, and today are reinforced by men. And the thing is, women have had it so much worse under these standards. For men, it became an aesthetic goal to chase, but for women, it became the standard, the necessary. For men, the perfect body was something to admire, but for women, it was an expectation. Men created the system, yet it's women that have paid the highest price. So unless men actually confront the standards that they've created and reinforced, nothing changes. History doesn't change by accident, it changes when the people that build the system finally admit that it's broken. So the reinforcement of these ideals by men and culture and the media really has to come to an end. And understanding is the first intervention. The ancient body was symbolic, but the modern body is lived. Worth does not come from symmetry, proportions, or perfection, and real confidence comes from care and acceptance. Self-improvement can be perfectly healthy if it comes from love rather than insecurity, hate, and fear. Your body isn't supposed to be an argument, so stop trying to prove a point. It's a home, so please treat it like one. Ancient sculptors were carving values, and we've mistaken them for instructions. This misunderstanding has consequences. So here we are in 2026, and people are still comparing themselves to ancient statues that were never meant to be human. I really hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, then please let me know in the comments below, and if you haven't, then please do the same. I really hope you've enjoyed. All mistakes are my own, and see you in the next one.